Hello and welcome again. In this fifth and last segment, I want to talk about some of the consequences of violence, and I also want to offer some general observations about violence, a bit about the structure of violence, and and how it happens. So let's move right into talking about some general observations about violence and its consequences. The first thing that we can say is that the consequences of violence are deep and they are long-term. They go into the social fabric and the conduct of political and other forms of public life. That is to say, that violence transforms communities and it transforms politics in communities. Some of the transformations that communities experience are intended, and some of them are not. If you want to talk about the period after violence, a good deal of intellectual energy, a good deal of the energy that is dedicated to engagement in public life is oriented toward violence. There is energy directed toward documenting violence, toward explaining violence, toward seeking responses to violence, and there is also energy directed toward justifying violence that occurred or to denying the scope and scale of violence that has occurred. What we might want to say in talking about violence in conflict or violence in a social environment is a little bit like talking about violence in films. You ask the question, is it gratuitous or does it contribute to the plot? Does the violence have a purpose? And what do we understand when we mean by plot? We mean, does violence tell us something about the motivations of actors? Does it tell us something about consequences? Does it do something in terms of the future? And I think what we can probably understand, we probably already understand this instinctively, is that violence plays a very large role in orientations that social actors take in the immediate future, in the period immediately following. We can also talk about some of the complexities of violence as it actually occurs. First, in all of the violence that we're talking about, there is some form of international intervention. International intervention usually takes place with some kind of intended consequence, usually to separate warring parties, to create conditions that will address some of the needs of victims. So it has these intended consequences, and it also has some consequences that are not intended, including, for example, through processes like separating warring parties, freeing up force that would be used on the front lines with warring parties to be used for violence against civilians, that is to engage in the violent realization of eliminationist political goals. Second point about violence is if we tend to think about violence in terms of warring parties and in terms of fighters being opposed to one another, you look at what actually happened in a lot of communities, it was not always the case that fighters were exclusively opposing one another or were always opposing one another. More often, the structure of violence, and we can see this in the structure of victimhood, involves organized military and paramilitary forces committing violence against civilians who are generally not prepared to resist. We can also talk about violence having social and economic consequences and correlates that occur that are contemporaneous with the violence, like the emergence of black market smuggling, the various sorts of para-economic activities that emerge in order to cope with crisis that is created through the commission of violence. These have consequences. In particular, they have consequences for the distribution and the redistribution of political and economic power in the communities where they occur, because in places where there is not the quick and consolidated establishment of a legal order or a military defeat, people who gain political and social advantage through their participation in para-economic activities like black markets come to constitute the core of the emerging political and economic elite in the post-violence community. So there are path dependencies that emerge from violence that continue to affect the lives of communities after violence has occurred. two general observations that I would make about violence then, both of which I think are implicit in the points that have been made so far. First of all, although we talk about communal violence and we talk about spontaneous violence being generated by circumstances, we don't really know about instances of spontaneous violence in general. Violence does not occur where it is not encouraged and assisted and supplied materially and intellectually and ideologically by groups of people holding political power. Second, we talk about violence and conflict and post-conflict conditions, but violence does not end when the physical violence has ceased. Violence is continued in the way that violence is engaged in the post-violence environment, particularly in the efforts of parties that committed violence and parties associated with them to justify and to deny the scale and scope and motivation of violence that was committed. These are all general points about violence, which are certainly not exhaustive. They don't cover the whole scope of understanding of violence, but I hope that they will provide points that we're able to discuss when we have our seminar session